In 1999, Edward A. Dames, a retired major in the United States Army, delivered the following words in an interview.
We became better after our training process was over than the best natural psychics that ever lived. I became the training officer and the operations officer for a new psychic intelligence team, and we had a very, very interesting and colorful history.
Dames is referring to his participation in Stargate Project, a CIA initiative to investigate psychic phenomena. From the 1970s to the early 90s, the United States military attempted to harness the powers of the human mind to benefit their own intelligence operations.
Major Dames' work largely focused on a psychic tool known as remote viewing, the process of being able to see far-off places or objects without needing to be physically present.
The CIA claims they terminated Stargate Project and declassified the operation in 1995 because it never provided any results.
Edward A. Dames, however, would say otherwise.
And he's not the only one.
So what is the truth? What is the human mind really capable of? And why might the United States military not want us to know?
Although the phrase remote viewing only surfaced within the past 4 decades, psychic phenomena has had a presence in our culture for thousands of years.
Around 440 BCE, Herodotus penned Histories, widely considered one of the founding works of Western literature. In Histories, Herodotus writes about the steps that Croesus, the king of Lydia, took to find a trustworthy oracle. After the death of his son, Atys, Croesus hoped an oracle might help prevent more tragedy. But he was extremely wary of fraudsters and charlatans, so Croesus created a test to prove which oracle was real.
In secret, Croesus chopped up a tortoise and a lamb and boiled them together in a brass cauldron. He then summoned the locals claiming to be oracles and asked each one what animal he was cooking.
Only one oracle was correct, the oracle at Delphi. An excerpt from one English translation reads, "On my sense there striketh the smell of a shell-covered tortoise, boiling now on a fire, with the flesh of a lamb in a cauldron. Brass is the vessel below, and brass the cover above it."
Today, most historians acknowledge that these oracles were more than likely influential figures who had informants to help them. That being said, it's important to note some specific aspects of this story that parallel work later performed by the U.S. military.
First, Croesus conducted a blind, controlled experiment in order to evaluate the oracle's abilities. He also did so on a specific date and time.
Second, the oracles delivered their messages in verse, heightening the message from standard vernacular.
Third, the Delphic oracle's response used specific sensory information in their vision. The vision begins by describing the smell of the tortoise being boiled. It doesn't only relay what they saw in the vision.
However, oracles eventually fell out of favor, and from the ancient Greeks onward, most of our cultural references for psychic phenomena come from entertainment.
Until the 19th century, when a few daring scientists began earnest attempts to prove the existence of extrasensory perception, which is today more commonly referred to as ESP.
In 1882, in the midst of the spiritualism movement, the Society of Psychical Research was founded in London. It still exists today. The homepage of the Society's website claims that they were the first organization to conduct scholarly research into human experiences that challenge contemporary scientific models.
In other words, they studied psychic and paranormal phenomena.
On February 20th, 1882, the Society of Psychical Research named prominent philosopher Henry Sedgwick their first president. Contrary to what one might think, Sedgwick was not a fringe academic in his day. Just 1 year after being named president of the Society of Psychical Research, Sedgwick was named the senior professor of philosophy at Cambridge University.
In Sedgwick's words, the Society's goal was to drive the objector of telepathy into the position of being forced either to admit the phenomena as inexplicable, at least by him, or to accuse the investigators either of lying or cheating, or of a blindness or forgetfulness incompatible with any intellectual condition except absolute idiocy.
Some of the Society's earliest test subjects were 5 sisters from Buxton, Derbyshire: Emily, Alice, Mary, Kathleen, and Maud Creary.
Growing up, the 5 sisters allegedly played a game they referred to as the willing game. One of them would exit a room, during which time their father and their other sisters would select an object in the room.
When the sister that exited re-entered, she would have to guess the object they had selected. According to their father, Reverend A.M. Creary, they did so with incredible accuracy.
When asked how they would select the object, the sisters said they chose the item that appeared the most vivid in their minds.
Intrigued, the Society of Psychical Research created experiments to test the sisters, such as asking them to name the number and suit of a hidden playing card. The Society began running these experiments in April of 1882. Though the Creary sisters' success rate was never perfect, they were still shocking. Their correct answers far exceeded what could mathematically be attributed to chance.
In 1888, after the girls had undergone nearly 7 years of testing, the Society of Psychical Research concluded the sisters were telepathic.
Unfortunately, that same year, 2 of the sisters admitted to cheating. Apparently, the girls were giving subtle physical cues to assist each other in their guesses. One of their testers, Edmund Gurney, wrote, "When the 2 sisters were in sight of one another, the signals used were a slight upward look for hearts, downwards for diamonds, to the right for spades, and to the left for clubs. Further, the right hand put up to the face meant king, the left hand to the face meant queen, and knave was indicated by crossing the arms."
Although the revelation of physical cues used by the Creary sisters hurt the credibility of the Society of Psychical Research, it's important to note that body language cannot account for all of the sisters' feats. There were tests performed in which they couldn't possibly have used physical cues.
And the Creary sisters didn't admit to always cheating. They claimed to only cheat when they felt pressure to perform consistently. They didn't want to disappoint. They were, after all, incredibly young. When the test began, the oldest sister was 17, and the youngest was just 10 years old.
Another thing to note, the girls' mood may have also played a role. When in good spirits, the sisters were more likely to accurately read one another's thoughts. And whether that is true or not, it won't be the last time someone makes that claim.
To many outside observers, the Society of Psychical Research suffered from their desire to discover the existence of psychic phenomena, as opposed to discovering the truth. Hoping for a particular outcome can cause even the most well-intentioned scientist to succumb to the pratfalls of bias.
Were some of the Society of Psychical Research experiments with the Creary sisters authentic? Or were they all just 5 clever girls giving grown men the answers they wanted?
We can't say definitely, but we can say the Creary sisters weren't the last ones to dupe the Society of Psychical Research.
In 1882, two men named G.A. Smith and Douglas Blackburn claimed they could communicate telepathically, so the society designed a test. This particular experiment asked Smith to duplicate a drawing made by Blackburn without any means of sensory communication between them.
Blackburn's description of the experiment reads as follows.
Smith sat in a chair at the large table. His eyes were padded with wool and bandaged with a thick, dark cloth. His ears were filled with one layer of cotton wool, then pellets of putty. His entire body and the chair on which he sat were enveloped in two very heavy blankets. Beneath his feet and surrounding his chair were thick, soft rugs, rightly intended to deaden and prevent signals by foot shuffles. Smith being rendered contact-proof and perfectly insulated, my part began.
Blackburn walked around the room, focusing on the drawing that he had made.
When the experiment ended, Smith replicated Blackburn's drawing perfectly. It appeared there was concrete evidence of telepathy. Until
26 years later, in 1908, when Blackburn admitted to faking the results. He said he used a pencil that could hide a rolled-up drawing inside it. When Smith claimed to have received the image, he asked for a pencil, and Blackburn handed over the trick pencil with his drawing inside.
Though Blackburn admitted to fraud, Smith did not. He maintained that he held psychic abilities for the entirety of his life.
It boils down to one man's word against the other.
Well, who's to say that Blackburn wasn't lying when he admitted to cheating? Well, who's to say he wasn't put up to it by someone who wanted everyone to believe it was fake?
Either way, the optics of the Society's experiments were not good. The credibility of the Society of Psychical Research continued to suffer. Psychologist C.E.M. Hansel writes in ESP and Parapsychology, a critical re-evaluation. As it is, the outcome of the investigations of the Creary sisters and of Smith and Blackburn merely demonstrate the fact, confirmed time after time, that intelligent men can be deceived quite easily when their powers of observation are biased by their underlying beliefs.
But as all good conspiracy theorists know, the failure of one experiment to prove the existence of something doesn't necessarily disprove its existence. The experiments with the Creary sisters and Smith and Blackburn weren't the last efforts to find out the truth about ESP, not in the slightest.
In 1921, French chemical engineer René Warcoli would become the first scientist ever to put forth theories on just how telepathy might work.
Decades before the CIA began experiments with remote viewing, a French chemical engineer named René Warcoli published a book titled La Télépathie. After the book's 1921 publication, Warcoli became a leader in the study of ESP.
In fact, in 1940, Warcoli became the editor of the Revue Métaphysique, the scholarly journal for the Institut Métaphysique International. Then, in 1948, he published a follow-up to La Télépathie called Mind to Mind.
In Mind to Mind, Warcoli wrote that he believed that psychic communication is actually relatively primitive, a pre-language form of communication.
He also believed that telepathy shared more of a connection to wishes, emotions, and fears than to the sharply defined objects of the world. It related more to instinct than to analysis.
Warcoli also asserted that there was nothing supernatural about psychic phenomena. It could be attributed to real psychological aspects of the mind. It was around this time that the term parapsychology gained popularity, an attempt to legitimize the science of psychic communication.
Perhaps most importantly to future developments in research, he believed that information transferred via telepathy always came in the form of an image. Workoli wrote in Mind to Mind, "As the telepathic impulse takes shape, it wells up into the consciousness of the receiver or percipient and takes the form of images. These images may be distorted as are dream images, whose symbolism calls for interpretation."
It's that exact word, interpretation, that skeptics of psychic abilities have always had a problem with. With so much up for interpretation, it is near impossible to create a controlled experiment. Workoli himself even acknowledged as much and designed his experiments to account for that. Workoli separated his test subjects into 2 different rooms to prevent corroboration. He then designated one as the sender of information and the other as the receiver.
In one room, the sender would draw an object or scene on a piece of paper, thereby creating what he referred to as a target. In another room, sometimes another city or country, the receiver would attempt to draw the same image.
The results of Workoli's experiments were relatively positive, and he believed he was able to identify factors that affected accuracy. One such was that the messages took time to transfer from sender to receiver, like sending a letter in the mail and then waiting 3 to 5 business days for it to be delivered. He called this concept latency.
He also asserted that telepathic messages were delivered in multiple transmissions, and those transmissions might affect each other, even if they were sent at different times. For example, if a series of letters were lost in a postal mix-up and delivered out of order.
Another hurdle Workoli describes in Mind to Mind is the human imagination. He writes, "The purposeful attempt on the part of the percipient to use his imagination to gain the telepathic impression seems to hinder success."
Workoli claimed that memories and the human imagination were stronger than telepathic communication and could thus interfere. If an image was drawn incorrectly, he believed it could often be traced back to what he calls an interfering memory. In essence, people might draw what they wanted to see rather than what they actually saw.
Workoli's research added a level of legitimacy to the parapsychology community. Even still, Workoli acknowledged that his studies were just the beginning. He knew more work had to be done, and in order for that to happen, a shift needed to happen. Parapsychology needed to be embraced by the scientific community at large.
Though that acceptance didn't come in his lifetime, research into telepathy and other psychic phenomena didn't stop. In the early 1970s, experiments began at the Stanford Research Institute, an independent institute not associated with Stanford University. These experiments became the basis for the Stargate Project.
The first experiments were led by scientists Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff. They were specifically interested in remote viewing.
Born in 1936, Harold Puthoff held a PhD in electrical engineering. Though he dabbled in Scientology, he later left the church. It's important to note, however, because his interest in parapsychology began during the years he was a Scientologist.
Russell Targ was born in Chicago in 1934. A well-respected physicist, Targ joined Puthoff at the Stanford Research Institute in the Laboratory on Electronics and Bioengineering in 1972.
At first, their studies were focused on individuals who already claimed to have developed psychic abilities, including some who were already well known for their claims, like magician Uri Geller and the psychic Ingo Swann. Geller and Swann's celebrity immediately garnered attention for the Stanford Research Institute's program.
Geller's claim to fame was his purported ability to bend a spoon with his mind. Unfortunately, in strictly controlled conditions at the Institute, Geller was unable to repeat the feat, and once again, credibility for parapsychologists suffered.
The silver lining was that Targ and Puthoff's experiments didn't allow Geller's sleight of hand to undermine their process. Unlike previous investigations, it appeared that they managed to create a controlled environment that could prevent fraud.
And despite this early disappointment, public opinion only shifted in their favor through the 1970s. In 1975, the University of Otago in New Zealand surveyed a number of psychology students about their beliefs in ESP.
The results were surprising. A majority of the students believed in ESP. Even more intriguing, a third of them believed that they themselves had psychic powers.
The poll was conclusive evidence that the public was interested in phenomena that had yet to be accurately measured by science, including palm readings and astrology.
And as the public's interest in parapsychology increased, the United States government did as well.
You're likely familiar with the space race and the nuclear arms race. You might be less familiar with another Cold War race, the mind race, or the espionage race.
When the United States discovered that Russia had been studying parapsychology and remote viewing for years, the U.S. government began to fear that they may be falling behind the communists when it came to developing weapons.
According to Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder, co-authors of the 1970 book Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, the United States had been focused more on proving the existence of psychic abilities, while the Soviet Union was focused on applications for psychic abilities.
This initial difference was due to the classification of parapsychology in each country. While the USSR considered it a branch of biology and physiology, the United States barely embraced it as a subset of psychology.
But thanks to the Cold War, that was about to change. In an interview in 1979, Congressman Charlie Rose had the following to say about participants at the Stanford Research Institute. What these persons saw was confirmed by aerial photography. Some of the intelligence people I've talked to know that remote viewing works, although they still block further research on it, since they claim it is not yet as good as satellite photography. But it seems to me that it would be a hell of a cheap radar system, and if the Russians have it and we don't, we are in serious trouble.
In 1980, the House Committee on Science and Technology released a statement saying, given how advanced Soviet studies were, the United States Congress may wish to reassess the state of their own parapsychology research. Soon after, the government allocated money to substantially increase their efforts.
And this marked a move from experimenting on known psychics to experimenting on soldiers, regular people who'd made no claims of psychic ability.
Because of the top-secret nature of the government's studies, the timeline of the United States research can be difficult to nail down. From what we can glean, it goes as follows.
Prior to the increase in aid, in 1977, the Army Systems Exploitation Detachment began an evaluation called Gondola Wish to decide if it was worth pursuing remote viewing. After deciding it was worth continued study, that evaluation formally transitioned into a project titled Grill Flame in 1978. At first, their aim was to use the information gained psychically only to cross-reference existing intelligence.
A few years later, in 1982, the program became part of the Army Intelligence and Security Command under the name Project Center Lane. It had limited headquarters at Fort Meade, Maryland.
Then, in 1991, the program was returned to the oversight of Drs. Targ and Puthoff at the Stanford Research Institute. Here, it operated under the code name Stargate Project.
Under Stargate Project, the United States military and Ingo Swann trained soldiers in remote viewing for the next 4 years.
Up next, we'll look at the official remote viewing experiments that have been declassified by the CIA.
Now, back to the story.
In the midst of the Cold War, the United States learned the Soviet Union had been conducting research into psychic phenomena and ways to use it for espionage for years. Desperate for any advantage, the United States increased their own research into ESP and remote viewing. In the 1970s, the mind race began.
To be clear, Stargate Project was not a large unit. At any given time, it was made up of only 15 to 20 individuals. And according to participants like Joseph Mcmoneagle, their accommodations weren't exactly state-of-the-art. That said, the experiments ran for decades, and in 1992, the U.S. Senate allocated $2 million to Stargate Project for the next 2 years of continued experiments. In 1995, the CIA declassified documents associated with Stargate Project and their study of remote viewing. The documents identify a 6-step process that lead scientists Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff used for their studies.
Step 1. Target pool selection. Targets were objects that remote viewers would attempt to visit or see in their mind. The criterion for selecting these targets was fairly simple. They needed to be visually unique. For instance, instead of selecting a particular street corner as a target, they would instead select a bridge, garden, plaza, or tower. It was vital that the subject have no knowledge of the target.
Step 2. Subject orientation. This was, more or less, a briefing. Whoever was attempting to perform remote viewing, known as the subject, would be educated on the goals of the experiment. Often, they would be shown samples of prior sessions. It was stressed that raw sense data was most valuable. For instance, things like color, shape, smell, and texture. Reporting that they saw a round blue metal object was more important than trying to determine what the object actually was.
In step 2, the scientists also explained to the subject that imagination was an inhibitor. This instruction either corroborates parapsychologist Rene Warcolli's belief, or it was taken directly from his work.
Step 3 and 4 were called outbound experimenter behavior and inbound experimenter behavior. From what we can tell, these steps happened somewhat simultaneously.
The inbound experimenter was the person documenting the behavior of the subject, who would be attempting remote viewing of a target. The outbound experimenter was the person who would travel to each target and document anything he noticed. As the outbound experimenter traveled to each remote viewing target, the inbound experimenter would make the subject feel comfortable and safe.
They would then give the subject a pen, paper, and an audio recorder. The subject was asked to describe or draw the outbound experimenter's location.
Part 5. Feedback. The outbound experimenter would return and provide the results. Apparently, in this step, it was critical that the subject feel a sense of completion. They didn't want one experiment to somehow bleed into the next.
The final step, judgment. In this step, an unbiased judge would receive images of the drawings and recordings from the subject and try and match them with images of the target. This could be done in 2 ways, direct matching or rank ordering.
Direct matching was a 1-to-1 match between the subject's observations and the target's. Rank ordering paired each target with all of the observations, ranking them from most to least likely.
If that whole process sounds a little vague and confusing, you're not alone. Some people believe that Targ and Puthoff intentionally overcomplicated their methods to appear more credible. Targ and Puthoff have also been accused of altering their data and intentionally making it vague. With this in mind, there's data from Stargate Project that could be interpreted to mean remote viewing is real. However, the CIA chose not to interpret it that way, shuttering the project in 1995, the same year they declassified it. However, Ingo Swann, in his lifetime, maintained the legitimacy of Stargate Project and all of his work. In fact, he scoffed when people asked him to test his abilities, saying, "I only work with researchers on well-designed experiments."
Targ and Puthoff also insisted on the legitimacy and importance of their work.
Though it's important to note that it would be normal for anyone to defend their life's work, even if it was proved fruitless.
Since Stargate Project's documents have been released, there have been other attempts to replicate their experiments. New Zealand researchers tried to replicate the methodology of Targ and Puthoff, and their findings were firmly in the remote viewing is impossible camp.
Today, the scientific community at large refutes the idea of psychic abilities and remote viewing, and officially, remote viewing is no longer a practice in any branch of the U.S. government.
But not everyone is so convinced that the CIA terminated Stargate Project because remote viewing wasn't working. Which brings us to the conspiracy theories.
All of which posit that Stargate Project found out too much information, not too little.
Conspiracy theory number 1. Remote viewing was used for espionage in Eastern Europe and South America and uncovered top-secret information that the CIA didn't want leaked.
Conspiracy theory number 2. Remote viewing was used to try and uncover mysteries that the CIA wanted to cover up.
And conspiracy theory number 3. Remote viewing was used to travel into space, and the CIA didn't want the public to know about extraterrestrial life they found. Well, next week, we'll dig into those theories. And you may be thinking to yourself that they all sound a little unbelievable, but the first step to believing
is opening your mind.
And if you open your mind,
maybe you'll find yourself on Mars.
Joseph Mcmoneagle shut his 2 eyes in order to open his third. He took a deep breath in and out. Transporting your mind to a place you have never physically been to required concentration.
Anytime he tried to explain the psychic process known as remote viewing to friends, he had to stress that it wasn't the type of seeing that they were used to. Not like a picture or a film. It's a kaleidoscope of senses, and you have to grab what you can while you can.
Today, he didn't know where he was visiting. He had only been given coordinates. Another breath in and out. And he arrived. He immediately felt fear and confusion. There was a big yellow pyramid and people, but not people. Other beings. They were scared, worried. They needed a new place to live. They lived on Mars.
Then he was back.
Mcmoneagle opened his eyes.
He was laying on a couch in Fort Meade, but had he just discovered extraterrestrial life? The CIA terminated the Stargate Project in 1995 after a formal review recommended the closure of the project. The review stated that evidence for the operational value of remote viewing was not available, even after a decade of attempts.
The focus of the review was on the research and procedures of Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ at the government-funded Stanford Research Institute.
The review claimed that some subjects in the Stanford Research Institute experiments, who were meant to be blind participants, actually had access to vital information prior to joining the group. That information potentially skewed the data towards success. Whether the padding of their results was intentional or not, it didn't matter. The CIA couldn't condone its illegitimacy.
But, interestingly enough, the report never concluded that remote viewing was not real. It simply explained that it was unlikely that remote viewing, as currently understood, will prove of any use in intelligence gathering due to the conditions and constraints applying in intelligence operations and the suspected characteristics of the phenomenon.
The report only questioned remote viewing's effectiveness and practicality.
However, those conclusions were drawn from people outside of the Stargate Project. As for the participants, well, they have a much, much different story.
Their accounts lead to our first theory. Remote viewing was used for espionage until the spies found out too much, and the CIA realized the tactic was more of a liability than an asset. We can conclusively say that the U.S. military did use psychics in their intelligence operations. How often they were employed is up for debate. According to military officials outside of the Stargate Project, psychics were only employed after all other tactics and attempts had been exhausted. They were a last resort.
At any given time, the Stargate Project was made up of about 15 to 20 individuals. A number of those participants have been outspoken about their time there, including 20-year Army veteran and Legion of Merit honoree Joseph Mcmoneagle.
Mcmoneagle was one of the first men recruited to work with the Stargate Project as a remote viewer. Though he admits that remote viewing wasn't a popular military tactic during the entirety of his tenure, he claims the military's hesitancy had more to do with the military's closed mind than the tactic's accuracy.
It was a result of what he calls a ridicule factor. No matter how effective they were, nobody wanted to be associated with something so out there. The military's opinion of the Stargate Project was perhaps embodied in its accommodations. Mcmoneagle called the headquarters old leaky barracks.
In direct contrast with the CIA's statements, Mcmoneagle's recollection of the Stargate Project was anything but ineffective. In fact, he claims it was nothing short of miraculous.
According to Mcmoneagle's book, Memoirs of a Psychic Spy, The Remarkable Life of U.S. Government Remote Viewer 001, the NSA reached out to the Stargate Project to substantiate their claims of an information leak at a consulate in the Mediterranean in 1980. Frederick Atwater, the head of the remote viewing faction at the time, chose Mcmoneagle, codenamed Viewer 518, as the best man for the job.
So the NSA allegedly gave Mcmoneagle a photograph of the outside of the building that they believed the leak was coming from, and he went to work trying to see it, all while ensconced in Fort Meade.
As Mcmoneagle traveled across the world using only his mind, his body lay on a couch in a dark enclosed room. A project monitor and an agent from the NSA listened in from outside the room as Mcmoneagle reported what he saw.
In his book, Remote Viewers, The Secret History of America's Psychic Spies, author Jim Schnabel wrote that Mcmoneagle saw a flame-like emanation, some kind of unusual electromagnetic signal coming from a wall in a certain hallway behind a water cooler.
Across the world, the NSA ran a search of the Mediterranean embassy, and sure enough, they found a water cooler, and right behind it, an electronic device transmitting messages. The NSA then asked Mcmoneagle if he could find where the signal was going, and he delivered.
He honed in on an apartment across the street, describing emanations coming from the building that may have been intercepting the signals from the embassy. He also noted that there were other distinctly different emanations coming from a level below those.
Incredibly, the NSA agent confirmed everything that Mcmoneagle had seen. Soviet spies had been camped out in an apartment across the street from the embassy, and American spies were camped out in a lower-level apartment. They were trying to listen in on the Soviets. Viewer 518 was right.
And that's just one example. Remote viewers like Joseph Mcmoneagle weren't only used for espionage against other countries. They were occasionally asked to spy on their own troops.
In 1976, Officer Melvin C. Riley was assigned to the military's remote viewing faction that would become the Stargate Project, then called Grill Flame. Along with Mcmoneagle, Riley worked under Lieutenant Frederick Atwater.
For one of his remote viewing assignments, Riley was given a target from the United States Air Force. Without knowing exactly what he was looking for or why, Riley followed instructions.
Atwater monitored Riley's sessions. While remote viewing, Riley saw a flying bat-like object that had a bulbous cockpit. He described the cockpit as something one might see in a 747 jet.
It all seemed pretty run-of-the-mill until Riley saw electronic wires that looked like lit-up strings. He reported it to the Air Force, and the Air Force immediately told them to stop remote viewing that target or anywhere near it.
It appeared Riley had touched upon something the Air Force didn't want known, but they didn't communicate further.
What did Riley find? Well, some believe he was picking up what even radar couldn't. It wasn't until much later that Lieutenant Atwater learned what Riley had really seen. Atwater was watching the news when the Air Force unveiled their latest aircraft, the B-2 stealth bomber.
How was he so sure? The B-2 stealth bomber was equipped with fiber optic control wires to limit its ability to be picked up by enemy radar. Wires that, to an untrained eye, look an awful lot like lit-up strings.
It made sense to Atwater. The Air Force wanted to find out if their anti-radar technology could prevent enemies from remotely viewing the B-2 stealth bombers. Once they realized that Riley could indeed locate the craft, they shut the process down. It's likely they couldn't risk him gleaning more top-secret information that could potentially be dangerous if they were captured, for Riley and for the U.S. military.
Well, the important part is, Riley's and Atwater's testimonies seem to point towards remote viewing being not only effective, but occasionally too effective.
Riley also claims that in his time as a remote viewer for the military, he remotely viewed Soviet research facilities, helped locate hostages in the Middle East, found narcotics traffickers during the war on drugs, and more.
All of which seems contrary to the assertion that remote viewing had no value. According to the remote viewers, their espionage efforts proved successful on both foreign and domestic fronts. Could it be that the CIA terminated the Stargate Project for the same reasons that the Air Force shut down Riley's session? To protect top-secret information from getting into the wrong hands.
After all, when you can travel space and time with your mind, there's no limit to what you can uncover.
Joe Mcmoneagle and Mel Riley both claim that the remote viewing missions with the United States military were not only real, but highly effective. They've each given detailed accounts of their experience from the 1970s through the 1990s, when they successfully spied on Soviet forces and remotely viewed top-secret United States military aircraft.
Mcmoneagle also claimed he assisted in the Iranian hostage crisis and spied on Libyan revolutionary Muammar Gaddafi. No claim, however, is as startling as what each man said he saw in 1979.
In 1979, Mel Riley was given another assignment, to remote view a test facility in China. When he came out of the session, he made some sketches of what he saw. One particular sketch stood out. It was a shape that looked like a basketball with two large funnels. Riley wasn't a nuclear physicist. To this day, he claims that he couldn't possibly have known what one might look like. But he had drawn a nuclear bomb.
Two other remote viewers, Joseph Mcmoneagle and a man named Ken Bell, confirmed what Riley saw. Then, 3 days later, intelligence sources confirmed that there had been a nuclear test at the target facility.
In that same year, as part of the Stargate Project, Mcmoneagle allegedly aided the discovery of a new war submarine. Over the course of 3 sessions targeted at Soviet affairs, Mcmoneagle described what he saw as a submarine with as many as 20 missile tubes.
Originally, his description of the size and capability of the submarine seemed at odds with what officials at the NSC thought possible. But in 1980, the NSC obtained satellite photos of a Soviet submarine launch. It was the largest ever built, with capability for 20 ballistic missiles.
So, what do we make of our first conspiracy theory? That remote viewing operations were shut down after they uncovered top secret information, proving the Stargate Project a liability.
Based on the accounts of the Stargate Project participants, it's really a question of one government agency's word against another's.
Well, true. The Stargate Project, its participants, and leading researchers, Targ and Puthoff, all insist that their work was both real and effective.
It would be normal for anyone to defend their life's work, though, even if it was proved fruitless. Not to mention, many of the Stargate Project participants have gone on to use their alleged life experience to sell books or appear in the public eye.
Well, that doesn't necessarily discount their experience.
But it does add another layer of motivation, lying to make a good story.
Yes, though that being said, there's corroboration for many of their stories, and the CIA, unsurprisingly, has remained mostly silent.
I'd say that this is the least likely of our theories, because there are so many accounts from Stargate Project participants. If it was shut down to prevent the dissemination of information, the CIA is doing a bad job of it.
True, nobody is silencing Mcmoneagle or Riley, and if either had information important enough to warrant a CIA shutdown, wouldn't they have written about it in their books?
Exactly. While I do believe the Stargate Project was used in United States military espionage efforts, I still have reservations surrounding its effectiveness, if it was effective at all.
Agreed. There isn't any hard evidence either way. All in all, I'd rate conspiracy theory number 1 a 6 out of 10, with 10 being very likely and 1 being very unlikely. Mcmoneagle and Riley's accounts may have held some truth, but the practicality of the CIA making budget cuts seems more realistic than its suffocating information, at least in this case.
Agreed. Although I'm a little less convinced about the believability of their remote viewing, especially with remote viewing's history of fabricating evidence. According to Jim Schnabel's research, even for the best remote viewers, half of their sessions had little to no relation to the desired target. So I'd give this theory a 4 out of 10, much less believable.
However, just because Mcmoneagle and Riley's claims about the CIA's shutdown of the Stargate Project aren't likely, doesn't mean remote viewers never discovered something they shouldn't have.
Let's take a look at the circumstances surrounding our second conspiracy theory. Remote viewers were able to uncover information the government would rather keep secret, and the Stargate Project was shut down in an effort to keep secrets secret.
Much of this theory revolves around a claim made by remote viewer Dick Allgaier. Currently, he serves as the vice president of the Hawaii Remote Viewers Guild in Honolulu. In a remote viewing session, Allgaier claims he saw Adolf Hitler alive, years after he allegedly died by suicide in April 1945. Allgaier, along with other remote viewing enthusiasts, interpreted what he saw to mean that Hitler faked his own death. He lived out the rest of his days undercover in Argentina. The body, buried in Hitler's grave in Germany, was a look-alike.
Now, we should mention that Allgaier has no association with the United States military or the Stargate Project. In fact, he only became interested in remote viewing after the CIA declassified the Stargate Project in 1995 and released its documents to the public.
Starting in 1997, Allgaier obsessively studied the declassified documents beginning. Not long after, he began to remote view himself.
We should also mention that Allgaier is not alone in believing that Adolf Hitler faked his own death. In fact, it's a conspiracy theory that's been around since 1945, when Hitler died by suicide. The theory that Hitler faked his own death predates Allgaier's remote viewing session by half a century.
So it's impossible to say how much of what Allgaier saw and how much of his interpretation of what he saw was influenced by pre-existing seeds of thought.
And then there's the fact that in 1997, when Allgaier claims to have seen Hitler via remote viewing, Hitler would have been 108. While it was possible for him to be alive in Argentina, it was not likely.
Whether Allgaier's claims are true or not, they serve as an example of the type of information that the Stargate Project could theoretically have accessed, information that would warrant the CIA shutting it down, preventing any further research.
Which brings us to our final and most likely theory of them all. Theory number 3. Remote viewing was used to travel into space, where the Stargate Project participants found evidence of extraterrestrial life that the CIA wanted to remain hidden.
And reports of remote viewing being used to travel to the surface of Mars come straight out of the Stargate Project.
Coming up, did the Stargate Project go to space?
Now, back to the story.
While the U.S. and other governments experimented with psychic remote viewing from the 1970s to the 1990s, the method was officially debunked and the experiments were declassified in 1995.
And while most of these declassified documents focused on Cold War espionage, one among the thousands of pages stands out. Its title, Mars Exploration, May 22, 1984. The document serves as the official record of the government's actual assignments for remote viewers to target locations outside of planet Earth.
Whether or not remote viewers actually saw anything in outer space, we can confirm they tried to.
And our third conspiracy theory suggests that the studies on remote viewing prove the existence of extraterrestrial life, and suggest the government may have shut down the Stargate Project as a way to cover it up.
The names of the men involved were not originally released in the report, but Joe Mcmoneagle has since claimed he was the remote viewer mentioned in the May 22nd document. He also claims that, at the time, he had no idea that his target destination was Mars.
The document Mars Exploration, May 22, 1984, is written like a script. It contains nearly the entire conversation between Mcmoneagle and his monitor.
According to the declassified documents, the session took place in a dark room. Mcmoneagle was wearing headphones. He described seeing a pyramid and being surrounded by a yellowish ochre color. Then, Mcmoneagle's view was obstructed by what, in his own words, he described as, quote, severe clouds, more like a dust storm. It's a geologic problem.
At this point in the session, the monitor directed Mcmoneagle to go back in time, before the dust storm.
The instruction brought Mcmoneagle back to the pyramid, and then Mcmoneagle described sensing the presence of what he called people people who had been gone a long time.
He was instructed to go back to a time where they existed.
Mcmoneagle tried. He was directed to explore a specific location, but when he found it difficult, the monitor gave him free rein to explore. Once he was free to explore, he was able to capture a more vivid description of the beings.
He described the beings as very tall, wearing thin clothes, and that they were ancient. Mcmoneagle told the monitor that he understood that it was the end of their lives, and they were waiting.
In a very confused state, Mcmoneagle said the beings, quote, can't seem to get their way out, so they're hanging on while they look or wait for something to return. A party of them that went to find a new place to live.
There's an ambiguity around Mcmoneagle's description of what he saw, but if nothing else, the March 22nd document proves the United States government had a vested interest in exploring space by any means possible.
And Joseph Mcmoneagle is not the only participant in the Stargate Project to claim his remote viewing trips were missions to Mars. Major Edward A. Dames, a monitor for the Stargate Project, was an active proponent of space exploration.
He claims that they were able to locate life on Mars that matched the description of a particular species that many extraterrestrial enthusiasts refer to as the Greys.
According to common extraterrestrial lore, the Greys are unable to live on their own planet and have been searching for a new one.
And their main method of communication? Telepathy.
It's worth noting that in an interview with Slate, Mcmoneagle said he didn't understand why the government would be doing remote viewing tests on information they couldn't confirm. If they wanted to prove remote viewing, shouldn't it have been a verifiable test?
This leads us to believe that either, 1, the government had full confidence in remote viewing and was ready to use it to gain new information, or 2, they already knew extraterrestrial life was there.
In addition to Mcmoneagle and Dames, psychic Ingo Swann claims to have used remote viewing to travel to space. As a reminder, Swann was one of the earliest psychics to work with Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ at the Stanford Research Institute in the 70s.
In 1973, Swann and another Stargate participant, Harold Sherman, were recorded as they both attempted to remotely travel to Jupiter. They then compared their findings to see what, if any, similarities there were.
Interestingly, the differences in their descriptions are missing from the document.
The similarities are still in the records, but they're vague at best. Both described ice crystals. Swann mentions swirling vortices, and Sherman a tornado.
Still, it shows that the government had confidence in remote viewing, or confidence in life in outer space.
It's possible that the Stargate Project's monitors were trying to prove the viability of remote viewing with a classic police interrogation tactic. Oftentimes, law enforcement will intentionally keep evidence under wraps during an investigation. This way, if a suspect mentions something about said evidence, officers know that person is guilty, since that's information only the perpetrator would know.
Similarly, in the Stargate Project, the monitors may have given subjects a target they knew they most certainly wouldn't be aware of, such as specific locations of extraterrestrial life.
If a subject could accurately describe a top-secret alien civilization, then the CIA would be able to confirm that remote viewing was real.
And remote space travel wasn't the only remote viewing that claimed the existence of extraterrestrial life.
In 1973, one of the Stargate Project scientists, Harold Puthoff, was approached by one of the star remote viewers at the Stanford Research Institute. The remote viewer gave Puthoff an envelope that supposedly listed the locations of alleged underground bases where there may be testing on extraterrestrial life.
Puthoff conducted a series of remote viewing sessions to explore these supposed bases, but the sessions ultimately proved to be fruitless.
However, word of the experiments passed on through the years until the story reached Lieutenant Frederick Atwater in Fort Meade.
In 1982, Atwater decided to give his best remote viewer, Joseph Mcmoneagle, the same task.
Mcmoneagle attempted to view these locations. He described underground tubes, lots of space, and the feeling that there was a prototype of something present. He felt no presence of any beings, however.
In 1986, Melvin Riley was given the same task. He described a UFO-like structure with something that resembled a control panel. He said it was inside something like a mountain, and inside the UFO-like structure was something that Riley described as an organ.
But again, nothing living.
As exciting as those findings might be, both Mcmoneagle and Riley have since expressed their beliefs that what they saw was part of a radio tower complex that was meant to study the aurora borealis in Mount Hayes, Alaska. That is, after they found out their target destination was also in Mount Hayes.
Is it possible they were fed this story as part of a cover-up to conceal anything extraterrestrial they may have witnessed or suspected during the Stargate Project?
It's not impossible, but there's very little proof. For me, the accounts of remote space travel feel a little vague and thin, especially when considered that nothing can be corroborated. When considering this theory overall, I'd give it a 5 out of 10. Not impossible, but not likely.
That being said, the remote viewing of space was pursued. At the time, top government officials believed remote viewing had the potential to discover extraterrestrial life forms.
Yes, but to what end? For me, the nail in the coffin is the missing differences section in Swan and Sherman's descriptions of Jupiter. It feels like an instance of padding the data to skew towards success.
Sure, that makes sense. I don't know how much evidence of extraterrestrial life the Stargate Project actually found, but I think it's possible that the CIA would want to prevent them from investigating more. The declassified documents showed that the U.S. Senate allocated $2 million to the Stargate Project in 1992 for 2 more years of research. If it was so ineffective, why, even in the years immediately preceding its closure, was the government investing in its success? I have to believe that the CIA was afraid of something, and extraterrestrial life seems to be the one thing we know they were exploring that would also be enough to warrant a termination. So I'd give this theory a 7 out of 10.
Fair enough.
And who's to say that when the CIA terminated the Stargate Project, they didn't start an entirely new top-secret research department devoted to remote viewing?
I don't think we can.
If only it were possible for someone to spy on the CIA right now from the comfort of their living room.
Who's to say they can't?
I don't think we can.